everyone. This is John Daly. I'm here with the first episode of a new video series here on bernardgoldberg.com. I'm calling it the Daly Express, where I do some solo interviews with guests. Today, I'm talking to a writer and speaker who I'm a big fan of. You may have read his past work for Bloomberg, the Daily News, the New York Post. You can now find him at the RAGGED PUNSTACK on Substack, and you might even see him on the comedy circuit because he's not only hilarious on Twitter, he's definitely a great follow. He's also a stand-up comedian. I'm talking today with Robert George. How's it going today, Robert?
Doing well, John. Thank you for having me on. I feel honored to be on your debut effort here.
Well, it's an honor to have you. Thank you so much for joining me. I wanted to talk to you today about an interesting piece you just wrote for the RAGGED PUNSTACK, and we'll put the link to that in the show notes. But before we get into that, I have a funny sort of personal story to tell you, if that's okay.
Please do.
Okay, excellent. So the two of us met for the first time face to face in Washington, D.C. earlier this year at the principal's first event. We were at the reception the night before the actual event, and it was at a local restaurant. And before I left on my trip to come out to D.C., my wife, she didn't come because she had a work thing going on, but she kept joking with me about how there would probably be high-end DC hookers at the hotel I was staying at, and that I better stay away from them and all that, just joking with me. So anyway, you and I and some others were among the last to leave the restaurant that night, and we kind of closed out the place, even though it wasn't really that late. They were shutting things down, and I was standing outside the front door of the restaurant as we were leaving, and I was voice texting my wife that I'd call her in about 15 minutes when I got back to the hotel. And you happened to walk by right then, and you said, "I'll see you soon," meaning the next day. And that made it into the text because I was doing it with my voice, and I hit the send button. And so my wife, who knows I only voice text because I'm terrible at regular texting, was immediately all over me saying, "Who are you going to be seeing soon? The hooker up in your hotel room?" So I had to explain everything. I sent her your picture. I'm like, "He's not my type, but he's a very nice guy." So yeah, it was sort of a funny thing, and she still gives me a hard time about that. So, but
Well, I don't know. I don't know whether I should be offended that I'm not your type, but we'll have to go. We'll have to go with that. In the interest of keeping peace in the Daly household, I will vouchsafe for the fact that John was a complete gentleman at that event. No issues at all.
I appreciate that, Robert. Thank you very much. So anyway, let's get to your latest column. So you're a conservative. You're not exactly a fan of Vice President Harris, who may actually end up being the Democratic nominee for president this year. We'll see. But you took exception to a recent piece that was critical of, and I would say kind of rather demeaning of Harris. It was written for the New York Post by business writer Charles Gasparino, I believe it's pronounced. Robert, can you describe Gasparino's argument and why you believed it was heavily flawed?
And in full disclosure, I mean, you mentioned, we met at the principal's first conference down in D.C. So yeah, my background is in the conservative movement and Republican politics. In my previous life, I worked for the RNC and Newt Gingrich when he was speaker. However, I do fall into that amorphous but somewhat wide category of never Trump, and so as we noticed in that conference down there, that meant that we have to balance, past allegiances and principles and things like that with the reality of the current political situation, and so that's why we found many conservatives and Republicans, biting the bullet, and if not outwardly supporting Biden-Harris, at least recognizing that there's, depending on where you are, there's not a great options if that on one side, or Donald Trump, which many of us, I think, rightly recognize is not acceptable. So, that's just to get people a sense of where I'm coming from on these issues. And in another previous life, I worked on the editorial board of the New York Post, and I still have some friends and former colleagues over there. But that said, the basics of Charles Gasparino's column was that Kamala Harris is a DEI hire, and by default, she could become the first DEI president. And for those who don't know, DEI is diversity, equity, and inclusion, and it's sort of a construction of initiatives in corporate settings, where companies and businesses look at individual attributes to see how they can diversify the workforce. And it's gotten those initiatives have been around for many years now in many different environments, but they've come under some fair criticism, largely from conservatives, but not exclusively, that they tend to focus too much on the individual attributes of, say, of a candidate or an employee or something, versus more objective metrics like experience and knowledge and so forth. And so there's been pushback on the political level on these initiatives. I would say most aggressively what Governor DeSantis has been doing down in Florida and so forth. But the main, and Charles Gasparino has a book coming out focusing on DEI and other woke policies and so forth. So he decided to kind of use the hook that Vice President Harris is a DEI hire, and she would become the DEI president. There's been other conservatives on social media referring to her as DEI Barbie and so forth. And the issue that I had is twofold. First of all, I think commingling these corporate initiatives, which, as I said, are ripe for criticism, with what goes on in politics is just wrong. I think these are two separate buckets, and the implication, not just from what Gasparino is writing, but from what others have said, is that that Harris would, if you looked at her biography and that of, say, a generic white politician, she would. There's no way she should be even considered as vice president. When in fact, she was the district attorney in San Francisco, an elected office, meaning she had to make her case among other candidates, and the residents of San Francisco selected her. She was then Attorney General in California for 2 years. In fact, one of the reasons why Joe Biden selected her was the fact that he had met her in the context of a relationship that she had built up with the president's now deceased son, Beau, when Beau Biden was the Attorney General in Delaware. So Joe Biden, kind of knew Kamala Harris from that situation as well. So she then, of course, ran for Senate and was in the Senate for 4 years before she decides to run for president herself. And at the end of that process, Biden decided to select her as his running mate. Now, is the fact that she was a woman and a woman of color, was that were those elements in Joe Biden selecting her? Absolutely. But let's keep in mind that diversity in the ticket, however you want to define that, has been the hallmark of the vice presidential selection. Going back hundreds of years. Initially, it was more diversity of geography, where you might have a northern presidential nominee deciding to select a southern running mate, or vice versa. Take a look at JFK and Lyndon Johnson for that. In more recent times, it started to change, and we've had nods to gender with Geraldine Ferraro and Walter Mondale, Sarah Palin with John McCain, and now you've got this mix now with what Joe Biden is doing. Presidents will select a running mate as a meta message to an electorate that to a mixed electorate that they feel that they can't necessarily reach purely by themselves. And so in that context, Kamala Harris is as equally qualified, or if you want to put it in another way, as unqualified as previous as other vice presidential candidates, including, say, Dan Quayle or Mike Pence, the aforementioned Sarah Palin. So I think for conservatives who have issues with DEI to just start using this phrase kind of willy-nilly to besmirch a candidate or an elected official who happens to be, say, black or a woman or what have you, I think it's morally wrong, and I think it's politically stupid as well.
Yeah, and you bring up a really good argument. You say this is really about balance, and you got into that just now. But when you're talking about a presidential ticket, yeah, I mean, you can go back on all of these. I can think of very few exceptions where there wasn't sort of a balance thought put into to a president. I maybe Dick Cheney might be one of the few ones where.
But that's actually interesting, and that was and thanks for bringing it up, because that was one of the points that I mentioned. One of the more recent considerations has been generational balance. The reason why George W. Bush put Dick Cheney on there on the ticket was there was a concern that Bush was too young, and Cheney was considered, a wise elder statesman within the party. He'd been a longtime member of Congress. He was part of the Republican leadership in the House, and he was Secretary of Defense, during the first Gulf War. So he was seen as one of those wise, experienced Washington heads, and so. Basically becoming a ticket with a younger governor from Texas made a lot of sense. For similar reasons, Barack Obama selected Joe Biden. So you see the generational message is the balancing that we're talking about there.
Oh, absolutely. Another point you bring up in your column. You describe how there's been similar this DEI talk about Supreme Court Justice Jackson when she was nominated. You found that sort of that kind of rich, considering nominations made by Republican presidents in the past. Can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, exactly. So before the DEI became the code word of the moment, just 2 years ago, there were attacks on President Biden for having made the statement kind of early on that he was looking to select a black woman on the Supreme Court. So there was the usual outrage or fautrage, as they as they sometimes say on the right. How dare he make this just a racial and gender consideration in terms of, once again, shall we say, diversifying or balancing, another way of looking at it, the Supreme Court. And I said, well, diversity on the Supreme Court has been something that has also been going on for, I don't know, 100 years or so. There were discussions of the Jewish seat, the Catholic seat, though that's kind of rich now, because I think 5 or 6 of the 9 justices are all Catholic, so that kind of shows you how times change. But Ronald Reagan, when he was campaigning, he said it was time for there to be a woman on the Supreme Court, and he fulfilled that pledge, and put Sandra Day O'Connor on there. A few years later, after the first Black justice, Thurgood Marshall, steps down, the first President Bush, while he didn't make as much of an explicit statement, he selected Clarence Thomas to fill that slot, which more than a few people on the left and the right sort of recognized that as being not so much. I wouldn't necessarily call it cynical, but it was definitely a statement saying, well, I'm going to fill this liberal Black seat with a conservative Black seat. And if you looked at Thomas's judicial background at the time, he'd only been on the Court of Appeals for a little bit more than a year when he was selected for the Supreme Court, but he had a strong political background in conservative politics, and so he was selected. But race was definitely an element there. So the fact that it seemed they were saying that Biden was guilty, not of for selecting a Black woman, but for just saying that he was going to do it ahead of time.
That's a good point. That's a good point. Well, I thought it was a very interesting column. Like I said, I always like your writing because you think outside of the box. I did want to ask you one sort of unrelated question. We started this off by talking about Vice President Kamala Harris. Do you think she will end up being the Democratic nominee, or do you think Joe Biden's gonna stay in there as he clearly wants to?
Well, I'm hesitant to say this because between the second I say something and the time you edit it and this gets posted, so many different things, so many different could have changed. Monday morning, he sent out a public statement, basically to the main target was the really nervous Democratic members of Congress. He said he's sticking in. So and he's not going anywhere. We'll have to see how well that plays out in the next few days when more national polls and state polls come in to see whether he can actually fulfill that pledge. But the key point that a lot of Democrats are facing, and over the weekend there were a number of members of the House who started to say the president should step down. Making it unclear when they say step down, though, do they mean he should no longer be the nominee but fulfill his term? Should he resign the presidency and then allow Kamala Harris to run as an incumbent? I think part of the reason why there now seems to be more swelling resistance to the idea of forcing Biden out coming from the Democratic base is that a lot of the supporters don't know what that next step means, and they feel that as bad as Biden looked in the debate and as shaky as he looked in the Stephanopoulos interview, he's the best. The potentially catastrophic known of what of Biden as he is for the next 4 months or so is better in the minds of many Democratic voters than the multiple unknowns that are being suggested if he's not the nominee, and so that seems to be what's going on there. There's one other element that also somewhat taps into some of these issues we're talking about here in terms of race. The strongest part of the Democratic base are Black voters. And it was Black voters that, in a sense, gave Biden the nomination when he won South Carolina, particularly Black women voters. And it was interesting over the weekend that many of the House members who were saying that Biden should step down, there was not one member of the Congressional Black Caucus who stepped out that way. It was interesting that over the weekend that Joe Biden visited a Black church, and I put out a tweet over the Sunday. Isn't it kind of interesting? It's kind of hilarious that Democrats don't quite seem to understand that the Black church, which has sort of a history of willing to, stick with an elderly patriarch, even if he may be slowing down, even though it may be time to move on to a younger minister. Many churches will still stick with the elder patriarch, and I think that cultural aspect going within the Black community and some of those Black voters is something that could very well end up being the saving anchor for Joe Biden.
Interesting.
Of the Democratic race, I mean, it may end up, causing them to lose the presidency in November. But in terms of him being able to stick around, that could be where we're at.
Wow. I hadn't even thought about that. That's interesting. Well, Robert, that's probably a good place to wrap things up. I want to thank you very much again for joining me for the first episode of the Daly Express. It was a pleasure having you on. We'll add the Ragged Punchstack in the show notes so people could check it out there and subscribe to it. Is there anything else you'd like to plug, or do you have any stand-up shows coming up?
I've got some stand-up shows coming up in the next two weeks. So I think basically folks can follow me on Instagram at Robert George Comedy to find out announcements about where I'll be appearing, usually in the New York or tri-state area.
Excellent. Well, he's hilarious. You should listen to his stuff. You should follow him on Twitter, Robert. Thanks again.
On Twitter, that's right. On Twitter, I'm at Robert George, at Rob George. Yes.
Yep. Well, I'll put all this stuff in the show notes too, so everybody will see it. So thanks again, Robert. I hope you have a great day.
Yep. You too, John. Thank you very much.
Thank you.